I'm actually going to be quiet on this recording, and I'm going to kind of give you guys a little bit of a history lesson. There's a podcast called Hardcore History. There's a 5-part series called Blueprint for Armageddon that's all about World War I. I figured I'd play some of that and play some Battlefield. If you want to listen to some stuff and watch some violence, by all means stick around. If not, there's other channels. Because all you're really going to do is watch me die a lot. Because I suck at gaming.
The funny thing about human history, if you study military history, is that up until about 200 years ago, you can imagine armies from a very long time ago fighting and beating armies from not that long ago. I mean, Alexander the Great's army, I think, beats the Carolingian army of Charlemagne, which is, a first-rate army 1,000 years later. I don't think the Macedonians must their hair. I mean, there are books like Arthur Farrell's The Origins of War where that credible historian can't help but play with the Battle of Waterloo, inserting Alexander and his Macedonians from the 330s BCE in the place of Napoleon and his French, sending the Macedonians up against the Duke of Wellington and his British and their coalition allies, and having Alexander and the Macedonians do at least as well as Napoleon. So what does that show you? Well, it shows you how all of human military history changes at about the time of the Napoleonic Wars, because all of a sudden a new law of historical nature takes over, which says that earlier armies do not beat later armies. I mean, the rules changed 1,000%. First of all, think about today. If you took the U.S. Army from today, had it fight a battle against, the U.S. Army of 1945, today's U.S. Army destroys that Second World War army, mid-20th century army, and maybe doesn't lose a man when they do it. But that 1945 U.S. Army would defeat easily any army from the First World War. Any army from the First World War of the major powers would easily defeat the United States in the U.S. Civil War. And those Civil War armies, if they went back to Waterloo, beat Napoleon. So that's sort of the rule of the law of technological battlefield development for the last 200 years. And that's what the people in this story have had to try to suck up and understand. In 1700, some ruler can decide on a new musket design and not change it for 100 years, and he's still probably okay. In the 19th century, if you miss 15 years of development in rifle technology, you might lose a war because of that. I mean, think about something like the naval arms races and how this just destroyed everybody's treasuries and everything else. But at the beginning of the 1800s, you were using ship-of-the-line type stuff. I mean, the same naval technology of giant wooden ships with cannons all in the side that's been the way things have been done for a couple centuries. And when you build a ship and spend all that money and all that time, it's good for a long time. If it doesn't get destroyed in battle, that ship can serve you for 20, 30 years and just be fine. Great investment payoff over time. If you amortize the cost out over the decades, that goes away at the end of the 19th century, and yet the cost explodes. You look at a battleship from 1900, and it doesn't look like anything from Napoleon's time. It looked like a thoroughly modern battleship. The problem is technology is changing so fast now that in the time it takes you to design that new battleship, the 2 or so years it takes to build and launch and finish it, it may be outdated by the time it's ready to be used. You take a first-class, first-rate, fleet from a global power in 1914, and you pit it in battle against the first-rate, top-of-the-line fleet from a mere 14 years ago, and the one from 1914 destroys the one from 1900 and maybe doesn't lose a major surface vessel while doing so. That is mind-boggling to the people who lived back then, because that means if you can't keep up technologically with what your neighbor is doing at great expense, you can negate all the money you spent on that fleet in the first place. Better to not have that fleet from 1900 if you're just going to lose the whole thing and not even sink one of your enemy's ships. The need to keep up with the killing power of everyone else was impacting the treasuries of these countries in ways that created just as big of a threat to their continued existence as the threat of all these dangerous armies did. It was a catch-22 for them. Take the role that the Russian Tsar found himself in 1898, a guy named Nicholas II, maybe the single most powerful person on the planet. He's got a shaky regime. There's a lot of revolution, there's a lot of discontent, and a lot of it is exacerbated by the costs of trying to, keep up a modern military. And even with all these costs, he's falling behind. Russia's too illiterate. Its industries are too small. Its society still needs so much modernization before it can keep up with places like Germany and France and Great Britain and even the United States. The problem is that the Tsar's power is all in the country's size and the population. And that's becoming less and less important as technology begins to determine who wins and who loses battles. And that's being demonstrated all through the 19th century as these small colonial armies from the technologically sophisticated powers destroy sometimes giant armies of tribal natives all over the world. I mean, that line, the famous one that says, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun," and they have not, is about using machine guns on tribal peoples. The Russian Tsar is looking ahead and seeing that if he can't keep up with this technological arms race that seems to be never-ending and endlessly expensive, the Russians are just going to be the tribal peoples. And yet he has to have this modern military machine, because if his adversaries have it and he doesn't, he's going to lose any war he gets into. He loses his dynasty potentially either way. How do you get out of a mess like that? In 1898, the Russian Tsar thinks he finds a way, and he issues a public invitation to representatives from the other great powers who are, one degree or another, in the same boat he's into. No one knows what the next major war will look like, but everybody's had a chance to see some minor wars in the meantime, and if you sort of extrapolate what they were telling you, the next war is going to be horrifying. And Nicholas II was actually reading the guy who turned out to be one of the most accurate prognosticators of what the next war was going to be like. We talked about him in the last show, Ivan Bloch. Nicholas II is reading Ivan Bloch, and Bloch's predictions are horrific. So the Tsar wants out. He wants to figure out a way to stop this dangerous cycle that the modern world seems to be forcing all the great powers into. And I think it's a wonderful sort of commentary on the attitude of the times that these guys thought that they could do this. It looks like rainbows and unicorns to we modern people, but to them they must have thought reasonable people can sit down over cigars and whiskey, see this dynamic that we've got ourselves caught up in, realize that it's in no one's interest, and reasonable people can, figure a way out of this. And in 1898, the Tsar of Russia proposed something that would be called the Hague Conference to deal with this. There are many ways to look at the 1899 Hague Conference, and there'll be another one in 1907, by the way. And truthfully, it looks like an early version of arms control agreements you will see throughout the 20th century, which you can also view through multiple lenses. The first one is you can take it at face value, the way the Tsar sold it. If you want to use modern terms, the Tsar's PR people, when he issues this invitation to the rest of the world leaders, couches this whole thing as a common sense effort at a high-minded idea. He says the goal of this conference he wants to put together is, quote, "seeking to make the great idea of universal peace triumph over the elements of trouble and discord," end quote. We might sell an arms control conference today like that. This is the era where you really see for the first time in human history the growth of what today we would call the international peace movement. It's had many conferences before the Hague Conference to promote these ideas, and there was a general feeling of progress on these issues. And so the Tsar may have been playing into that, although the Tsar was kind of an interesting dude. Very much a similar role on the monarchy dice as the Germans got with Kaiser Wilhelm, a very mediocre sort of guy, not the sort of person you could imagine that getting this job from merit defense. He's the same Tsar, the last Tsar, by the way, who will fall victim and under sort of the sway of the person that is sometimes called the Mad Monk, Grigory Rasputin, although he's more interesting than that and probably deserves more credit than that. But it kind of, again, shows you the Tsar as a kind of an idealistic, romantic. I mean, he might have bought into this stuff. It might be legitimate on the Tsar's part. But like most arms control agreements, there's a realpolitik side to this thing. The Tsar knows that his armies are falling behind in this technological race. The old line about arms control agreements is if you're losing an arms race, it's a good time to have an arms control agreement. And when the powers that are invited to this Hague conference ask for clarification of what's on the agenda, the Tsar and his people give them 8 or 9 points that are going to be goals of the conference. And the 8 or 9 points to a 21st century mind are fascinating because it really shows you what the Tsar wants to come out of this conference. The Tsar's number 2 goal, for example, that the agenda gives to the rest of the participants says, quote, to prohibit the use in the armies and fleets of any new kind of firearms whatever, and of new explosives, or any powders more powerful than those now in use, either for rifles or cannon. End quote. Now, this is a staple to some degree of arms control agreements ever since. I mean, if the U.S. and the Soviet Union are having an arms control agreement or an anti-ballistic missile agreement or whatever, they may have rules on technological progress, but they aren't trying to stop all technological progress. What the Tsar wants to do is freeze things where they are. He doesn't want any more research to increase the killing power that already exists in militaries. He doesn't want any more deployment if you accidentally discover that new battleship gun that will shoot twice as far as your current one. You can't deploy it. He wants the size of armies frozen and then reduced. He wants the size of military budgets frozen and then reduced. This is a person who clearly shows that his main issue with the way things are is the pace of change, and he wants this conference to address it. Now, to modern people, who will often freak out if the promised phone upgrade that's supposed to be released today is late, the internet will blow up with angry people who have had their pace of change sabotaged. The people in the late 19th century can probably be forgiven for thinking something we would assume is impossible is possible. The first time I ever encountered this idea, by the way, was in James Burke's wonderful TV series from the 1980s, The Day the Universe Changed, where he asked the question, if humankind looks down the road where a particular branch of knowledge seems to be taking them, can they decide if they don't like the destination to just not learn that branch of knowledge at all, or to wall it off so that no one learns it? To modern people, that sounds impossible. To people in the late 19th century, they would have been able to show you multiple historical examples where that had been done. The Catholic Church was very good at it in medieval times, for example. There have been Chinese emperors who could do it well. The idea of creating forbidden knowledge and then preventing people from having it or using it was not unusual in this time period. That's what the Tsar wants. He wants to slow or retard the pace of change. And I always try to remind myself how whipsawed all these people were in this time period by the pace of change, too. That's really what the 19th century is, the era where it all speeds up. If you could, for example, graph human technological progress the way you would a stock market performance graph, starting at the beginning of human history, ending yesterday, and having your ups and downs all throughout history, you'd notice a couple of things right off the bat. The first thing you'd notice is that there are ups and downs. One thing the modern mind seems to find incomprehensible is that progress ever moves backward. The people who lived in 1900, for example, were reading history books that made that sound like a historical law of nature. They had every reason to believe that the era they were living in might be the last of a golden age before a fall, because after all, that's what had happened to every other golden age that they look back on. The first thing the modern mind sees when it looks at the historical stock performance chart showing human technological progress is that there's a bunny hop sort of dynamic going on. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You might get a big upturn, when the New Kingdom Egyptians come on the scene, maybe another uptick when the Han Chinese arrive, another uptick when the Roman Empire arrives, but after your Roman Empire highs, you get your Roman Empire bubble, don't you? And a couple hundred years later, when it's gone, you have Germanic barbarians in formerly Roman territory looking up at crumbling aqueducts and wondering what sort of giants once roamed the earth that could build stuff like that. So the first thing you're going to notice as a modern person is that technology doesn't always move forward. The second thing you're going to notice is that throughout most of human history, whether it's going up or going down, it's moving at a glacially slow pace. The amount of change from the beginning of time to about the Renaissance is nowhere near what you would expect if we were anywhere near the pace of change we have now. Very little overall growth until you hit the Renaissance, and then you see a little uptick. And then the century after that, a little bit more. And then about 1810, 1820, the graph becomes almost vertical overnight. It shoots up, and instead of ever plateauing, as we all know, it goes ever more vertical every day. Now, we're used to this because it's been going that way for a while. The Tsar's generation, that century, that's the first time it really takes off. And those people are looking at that as an extremely destabilizing force. The Tsar thinks perhaps an arms control agreement will help Russia from falling too far behind their more technologically sophisticated neighbors. Now, as you might expect, their more technologically sophisticated neighbors see this as an artificial constraint on the fact that they're winning. Take the Germans as a perfect example, a people who are trying very hard to make up for what they see as the rest of the powers treating them like dirt. They're the ones building more ships than anybody and trying to catch up to Britain. They're the ones modernizing their military every day. They're the ones who, instead of being panicked by the pace of change, are taking advantage of it. To them, this looks like an agreement that will lock in their inferiority. And by the way, that's a situation that will repeat many times after this period in arms control negotiations, trying to gain an edge on your opponent. If you are losing the arms race, as I said, good time to have an arms control agreement. Finally, there's an interesting group of people, and they really don't exist anymore, not openly, that are on the opposite side of the ledger from, say, the international peace movement that's ramping up during this era. The people who think that war is a good thing. Forget about international, goals or realpolitik. People that literally believe that humankind thrives on war and that without war, we will drown in materialism. It's the only thing that keeps us focused on the higher things. That's an idea that has sort of gone by the wayside in Western culture. Today, it's peace activists who argue against, realpolitik people. In the 1880s, for example, you have guys like the elder Helmut von Moltke who tries to explain to people why peace is not even a good idea. You're deluded. He said, quote, "Perpetual peace is a dream, and not even a beautiful dream. And war is an integral part of God's ordering of the universe. In war, man's noblest virtues come into play: courage and renunciation, fidelity to duty, and a readiness for sacrifice that does not stop at giving up life itself. Without war, the world would be swamped in materialism." End quote. Others will point out that if you decide to try to make war, a thing of the past, what happens to all those people that are in situations where, they're struggling against foreign oppression, for example? Are you going to tell someone they can't free themselves from a horrible oppressor because violence is bad? But finally, you also have the people that the modern peace activists would recognize very well. Those who adhere to a belief system that is difficult to argue with in terms of, historical proof. If you're going to use history as your guide, you're going to argue that the best way to keep peace is to be so strong that it is almost suicidal to fight with you. Best exemplified, perhaps, by British Admiral Sir John Fisher, who tries to explain to a friend of his that when he sounds horrific, he's really an advocate of peace.
We are losing.
And he said, quote, "I am not for war, I am for peace. That is why I am for a supreme navy. Did I not write in your autograph book at The Hague, the supremacy of the British Navy is the best security for the peace of the world? My sole object is peace. What you call my truculence is all for peace. If you rub it in, both at home and abroad, that you are ready for instant war, with every unit of your strength in the first line, and waiting to be first in, and hit your enemy in the belly, and kick him when he's down, and boil your prisoners in oil, if you take any, and torture his women and children, then people will steer clear of you." End quote. Well, as harsh as that is, it has a certain amount of historical evidence to back it up, doesn't it? When asked how to make war more humane, the nephew of Helmut von Moltke the Elder, that would be Helmut von Moltke the Younger, the field marshal in charge of Germany's war effort at the start of the First World War, famously said the only way to make war humane is to make it short. Hence, the Schlieffen. We talked about this so-called Schlieffen plan in the last episode. It's the almost mythological pre-war plan for how Germany was going to deal with this terrible two-front problem. My analogy is a bar fight. Isn't there a meme online that I saw comparing World War I to a bar fight? But it's a little like, Germany knows it's going to have a bar fight with France and Russia, but they know that France is going to be there 5 minutes before Russia, so they get to the bar right on time, knock France out, and 5 minutes later when Russia shows up late, they get to fight the Germans one-on-one. That's the war plan in a nutshell. But the questions surrounding this war plan have become maybe the number one most controversial issue that historians argue with each other and froth at the mouth over. And yours truly, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm just going to sit back, eat popcorn, and watch the very entertaining discussions on the so-called Schlieffen plan, because it's not just a this or that. It's like a Kennedy assassination thing where, every different theory you can think of is out there. There was a Schlieffen plan. No, there wasn't a Schlieffen plan. There was a Schlieffen plan. They were just modified. Modified by Moltke. They would not call it the Schlieffen-Moltke plan. It just goes on and on and on. And the people often on multiple sides of this issue are very credible. So I'm not getting, it's like trying to weigh in on a discussion with scientists. You just have to sort of watch sometimes. So I'm not going to take a position on the so-called Schlieffen plan. And we'll call it the Schlieffen plan because that's what everyone knows it by. But suffice it to say this. Schlieffen's retired for quite a long time before the First World War breaks out. So whatever plan the Germans were going to use are in the hands of Helmut von Moltke, the younger, the guy who's leading this whole, early war on the Germans' part. He's been the one designing this plan for a long time. After the First World War is over, you will get a bunch of German generals writing memoirs, sort of castigating this Moltke guy for deviating from Schlieffen's amazingly brilliant plan, is the way it was pronounced. If you just stayed with the plan the way it was supposed to be, we win the war. And so it's worth talking about the plan a little bit. From a military history standpoint, the Schlieffen plan, and again, I have to say, as it's normally understood, because somebody out there is going to have a very good piece of evidence showing it was totally up what I'm saying right now. But as it's commonly understood, the Schlieffen plan is a fantastic military gamble. It involves taking troops from basically everywhere else you might have to fight and taking as many of them as you can and sticking them on that one part that's going to be the sledgehammer, the head of the sledgehammer. And your superiority in numbers at the head of that sledgehammer is going to be so overwhelming it's going to crush everything. And then you can swing it around and trap all the French armies that are sitting on the French border, waiting to fight the Germans on the other side of the German border, but the head of the hammer is coming from Belgium, a neutral country. It's going to swing from above, and then it's going to collapse down on all those French armies facing the Germans and trap them in the rear. But it's a huge gamble. What if you screw up? What if the Russians mobilize faster than you think they're going to? Well, they'll be mowing down your tiny little forces left there to stop them, and they're not that far from Berlin, and the first territory they're going to take over happens to be the ancestral home of Prussia's nobility, including Kaiser Wilhelm. So nobody wants to see the Russians anywhere near Prussia, but they happen to be kind of near Prussia anyway, so that's a problem. Also, everyone knows the French are going to want to retake those territories that the Germans took a generation before, which is down at the Franco-German border, which means the French are going to attack there with a lot of forces. You pull too many people away from there, the French could be breaking through into southern Germany while the head of your sledgehammer is still working its way, around French flanks. It's a terrible gamble, because if you screw it up, you could lose the war. But let's remember two things. When Schlieffen is writing the war plan, and he supposedly came up with this idea, the conditions are different. The German army is different in size, so is the French army. The Russians have almost seen a complete collapse in 1905 of their whole dynasty. They're falling apart. They just lost a war against Japan. They're nowhere near as formidable as they'll be, 10 years later, right? 9 years later. But that's when von Moltke has to deal with things. And the situations are different, and he has to recalculate things. And the second part of that whole equation is that Schlieffen could afford to be a gambler, because he doesn't actually have to do it. Schlieffen is a gambler on paper. Moltke is a guy who has to make this work in real time and not have the downside happen and live through it. And he's more of a pessimist. Maybe you would say more of a realist. and he won't put as many troops in the sledgehammer part of the attack as Schlieffen would have dictated you should. He won't denude the other fronts to as great a degree and leave them that wide open. He can't assume that the war will be won so automatically that you can just know that Germany will be safe and won't be broken through in all these areas you've denuded. In other words, Moltke's a more conservative guy. But if this plan is true, I'm going to keep saying that disclaimer so I don't get in trouble. If this plan is true, it puts Moltke in a position of accepting a gamble of a plan for a guy who's not a gambler. But that's the plan. And in order to understand the sledgehammer side of this plan, you have to have some sort of conception of the size of the armies involved. For comparison purposes, and again, it sort of demonstrates how much things have changed in a military sense and how they've exploded since Napoleonic times. If you look at assumptions made by people who study the Roman Empire, one of the favorite subjects that they will debate is how many human beings were in the military of the Roman Empire at its height to police and take care of that massive ancient state. And I don't mean in any one battle. I mean the total military power of the Roman Empire at its height. And you will get numbers anywhere from 450,000 men at the low end and about 750,000 men at the higher end. Now, the numbers of Germans that are making their way through Belgium in August 1914 as part of the sledgehammer's head is at least 750,000. Some numbers put that up to a 1.2 million. That means that the flanking force, the head of the sledgehammer, as we keep calling it, that's moving through Belgium to smack the French like a door swinging on a hinge, is at least as large as the entire military of the Roman Empire at its height. And if those lower numbers are actually closer to the truth for the empire's total military capability, then you might have a German army moving through Belgium that's twice the size of the entire Roman Empire at its height. That totally justifies all of the worst fears of these people in the 19th century world about this. The kind of folks who would call a Hague conference and write about peace and all that kind of stuff. And the people who understood what the growth in the military technology was going to do. Ivan Bloch's ideas are about to be proven true in no uncertain fashion. These people were used to Napoleon. Well, Napoleon's giant gamble of invading Russia may have had, at its highest, 750,000 men across the entire front, from a giant front of Russia. That's what you have moving through the tiny little road system and railroad system of Belgium. Napoleon's Grand Army is your flanking force. Wow. Now, I keep trying to remind myself that what the Germans are trying to do here is not perhaps as much of a weird gamble as you might think. And we also need to remember that most of the people in the higher leadership positions in the German military have done all this before. In fact, they fought France before. It's probably the most important war that happened between Napoleon's times and the First World War. And most people outside of Europe know nothing about the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. But essentially, forget what it says, in the history books, because it makes it look like a 9-month war. Essentially, the Germans smashed the French in a month and a half. It's a fantastically interesting conflict, and it shaped the perceptions and views of these people in the higher leadership positions because they were junior officers who fought in that war, right? They watched two amazing things happen. They watched the German armies trap an entire French army of like 90,000 men in one of the French fortresses that was there to keep the Germans from crossing the border. And then the actual Emperor of France himself, a guy named Napoleon III, one of those interesting rolls of the monarchy dice, leads a relief army. He's going to break the siege, right, and rescue his other army of another 80 or 90,000 guys. And the Germans managed to surround the whole army with the Emperor and force them to surrender, which then, of course, means that entire army that's also trapped nearby has to surrender too. I mean, the French fought on for a long time, doggedly. The people of Paris rose up. I mean, there was a fantastic resistance after this, but the war was over in a month and a half. That was the way the Germans wanted to do it again this time. And the people who did it last time are the ones in command of a lot of these, corps and armies and in the general staff. Now, as the Germans try to make their way, through Belgium and not have this important time schedule screwed up, the French on the other side are trying to figure out what the heck's going on. Part of what we modern people have to remember, and I always try to put myself in their position, it's very hard because we're in an era where the battlefield, especially to Western powers, and most especially to the United States, the battlefield is totally visible for the most part. You can hide yourself in foliage sometimes, maybe. If you're nearby, we're going to have thermal sensors and stuff. But the battlefield is visible to us now, and we're used to this. In most of human history, the fog of war, as it's known, is huge. Because it keeps you from seeing what's about to happen until it just is about to happen. You don't get a lot of advance notice to plan. That's why aircraft start becoming really important, because they take the eyes of the military, put them up in the air, and extend how far back you can see. If you see, armies moving to another area, you can safely assume, I better move my armies to another area. Something's going to happen over there. During this early part of the battle, no one is sure what's happening on the Allied side. The French are as worried about how they get the British over here to fight, with as many men as they can bring over, as they are about where are the Germans coming and in what sort of strength. You see, the French have suspected for a very long time that the Germans were going to do this outflanking move in Belgium. That was not totally unexpected. The part that may have caught them off guard is what they were outflanking, the French through Belgium with. The guys running the French military at this time, working on their own war plans, assumptions, simply won't believe that the size moving through Belgium is as big as it is. And let's remember, Moltke will be criticized after the war by other German generals who are mad it's not bigger. And the French have huge problems here because they have one of the loosest agreements I've ever run into in my life for, military cooperation. Their battle plans call for the British Army to guard their entire lines. And when we talk about a line, the French military line runs from Switzerland in the south to Belgium in the north. Millions of men in multiple armies. And by the way, on the other side of the border, the Germans have the same thing. First time in human history that you've had millions of men squaring off against millions of men. But the French left flank is counting on having the British Army there to anchor it. That agreement has less paperwork attached to it than you would normally generate when you buy a house. For all intents and purposes, as we said, it's a handshake deal. A handshake deal that we will go to war with you if war breaks out, and a handshake deal with only one government in a country where governments can come and go, and where public opinion isn't unified, and a nation that you've had centuries of antagonistic history with, and only like 5 or 8 years of, friendly cooperation. What's more, when Britain gets into this war, and then the first thing that the British people hear is we're going to send the troops that would defend us if the Germans decide to land on our coastline to France, there's a lot of question over how many troops to spare. Eventually, the BEF will get to France with 70,000 men. 5 divisions, 4 infantry, 1 cavalry. To give you an idea of what 70,000 men, 5 divisions means on this front, the Germans are deploying like 85 divisions on the Western Front. 70,000 men seems like nothing. That's the tiny little, it's the army of a sea power, isn't it? That's the tiny little force that Bismarck, a generation before, that iron and blood German diplomat, had famously said when one of his aides said, "What if the British land their army on our coast?" He says, "Then I'll have them arrested." This is the army that was so small you could joke about arresting them. But here's the difference. Unlike all the other major armies of the participants in this war, the British Army are professional. Long-standing, regular force with a lot of people in the, especially the non-commissioned officer ranks, who were lifers and who, when this war started, immediately called up their reservists, guys who served 10, 15, 20 years before and had fought in places like South Africa in the Boer War in the turn of the century. The institutional memory of these units was deep. The quality of these forces was intense. They used to have, unlimited marksman practice and get financial rewards for winning it. They'd actually, a lot of the people in these units fought in actual combat with modern weapons. My favorite source from this early period is an Irishman, as you might imagine, who's actually fighting in the BEF. His name is John Lucy, and he's one of the few British side reporters, I guess you could call him, but he's a soldier, who writes from this very early period because he was right in the first wave. And he explains, the difference between his unit and the rest of the Continental troops. And he does so in a very chauvinistic, very proud fashion. But he claims, quote, "The British Army in 1914 was more used to battle than that of any other nation. It possessed the highest and bravest traditions that can be engendered in a fighting force, and its experience of wars was such that our own regiment, though a young one in the Army, had so many battle honors that they were difficult to memorize." End quote. Now, John Lucy's only 20. He doesn't have a long service history under his belt, but when the reservists arrive, he watches men who appear to be just regular folks off the street transform themselves into grizzled British veterans. Quote, "Our reservists came streaming in to make up our war strength. Cheerful, careless fellows of all types, some in bowler hats and smart suitings, others in descending scale down to the garb of tramps. Soon, like us, they were uniformed and equipped with field kits, and the change was remarkable. Smart sergeants and corporals and beribboned veterans of the South African War hatched out of that crowd of nondescript civilians and took their place in duties as if they had never left the Army. They were an excellent lot, but their numbers increased our strength to an uncomfortable extent." End quote. What John Lucy found to be an uncomfortable increasing numbers when they arrived at the continent seemed like a tiny little trickle of British soldiers. But the quality of this army, that came to be known as the Old Contemptibles, was of the highest level, matching the top German units. It was ironically under the command of a British general named French, who didn't very much like the French. Sir John French would lead the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, onto the continent just in time to play their historic role in what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle called the most terrible August in the history of the world. They'll be involved in several battles that are all called the Battle of the Frontiers. There's a bunch of little battles that are all sort of wrapped up into this one big event called the Battle of the Frontiers. What it really means is all the fighting that was going on along this front. There are several sort of thrusts and parries and counter thrusts that go on. I'm going to spend a little bit more time than I normally plan to for the rest of this series on this battle, because this Battle of the Frontiers is in so many ways the most interesting moment of this war. First of all, it's what we've talked about for an episode and a half now. It's the rubber meets the road moment, the testing moment for all this military theory and hypothesis that's been happening, in some cases, for the last 100 years. You get to see if people's assumptions about how this weapon system would work or that tactic would fare, you get to see, which of those turn out to be correct and which ones don't. And a lot of the time, these armies will go into combat hamstrung by decisions that were made a decade before in terms of what the army's doctrine is going to be, or the tactics, or how they're going to be, dressed and equipped. Take the French. The French will go into this modern war, and it is almost impossible to understand this today because it has a ludicrousness to it that shows off another century. You want to see the 19th century clash with the 20th century? It happens in this Battle of the Frontiers in August 1914. The French go into combat with almost the exact same uniform their grandfathers wore in 1870. A blue jacket with tails, wide red pants that look like targets, and acted like it too. Their officers would have white hats and white gloves. Again, targets. They will send cavalry to go fight that look like, I mean, you can go look at your history books in 1914, and they often have pictures of this cavalry. I told my friend who was always asking for, I would love to see a picture of Napoleon's cuirassiers, his famous cavalry with the breastplates and the horsehair plumed helmets, and the sabers and the whole thing. And I said, you don't have to wish for a picture of Napoleon's cuirassiers. They're going off to war in 1914. They look identical, armor and all. That's the old world going off to war, and you can see it visually. Think of how the French soldiers hamstrung by that. The British have been using khaki, for themselves since the colonial wars, in the 1880s. The French are going to go into this war looking like walking peacocks. And a ton of French soldiers will pay the price for that. They'll pay the price for not having much in the way of heavy artillery, too. Again, these were all ideas that you could logically back up. The French decided they wanted to have more mobile armies, so we don't need that big, heavy, cumbersome, slow artillery to slow us down. By the time that gets anywhere, the battle's going to be over anyway. Sounds great, in theory, till you try it. And you find out your soldiers are in terrible trouble on the actual battlefields because they don't have any heavy artillery. There's a reputation the French have militarily in the United States that is inordinately influenced by the way the Second World War went. I always try to tell people, you misunderstand France's military reputation then, because for hundreds of years, they're considered one of the finest, if not the finest, land army in the world. 100 years before this time, a little Corsican guy is using, especially as the hardcore of his armies, to conquer the majority of the world that mattered at this time, and the one that owned the rest of the majority of the world as colonies, and did it with French troops. They will often heroically throw their lives down to try to overcome these deficiencies that they enter war with. I think you could make a case that in all three wars, that over 75 years the French and Germans fought with each other from 1870 to 1945, that the average French soldier on the ground was hamstrung by his leadership in all three of those conflicts. In the Second World War, historically, tragically. But I would suggest that the war out of those three in which French leadership performed the best was in the First World War. There are a bunch of different generals that I think Second World War France would have given their right arm to have, led by a guy who is iconic. I've always thought of him as like the French Churchill. What Churchill was to Britain in the Second World War, this guy is to France in the First World War. And he has all these same stereotypically interesting anecdotes and characteristics that Churchill had, but instead of them being stereotypically British, as Churchill's were, they're stereotypically Gallic, they're French. Churchill had this thing with alcohol that was part of his image and part of the fun. With this guy, it's food. And that's because it fits perfectly with his physical sort of image. He's huge in every way. He's tall, he's fat, he's got a giant bushy white mustache and a placid look on his face all the time. His name is Joseph Joffre. And if I mispronounce that again, that's just going to be the first of many. My apologies, because he's still, the Lion of France in a lot of French households. He's a fabulously interesting guy, but, I've read a significant amount on this person, and I'm not sure I understand him any better than before I started, and what's more, I'm not sure these authors did either. He is like an obelisk. He is imperturbable. Good luck scratching the surface of figuring out what you have there, and even his contemporaries felt that way. One thing when you read quotes that people who knew him say about him is, one, they say different things sometimes, and two, sometimes they didn't know what this guy was up to. Sometimes you look at something and you wonder if he's just a little dull or slow, or is he, sly like a fox and just hiding everything. He's an interesting guy. You could probe this guy a long time and still not really get a good idea about what you're dealing with here. The one thing you can say about him is he's got one of those qualities of generalship that's just going to be a perfect match for what's needed at the time. And I've always said that, generalship is absolutely an art. And in the same way that art, sees the manifestation of the artist's personality sort of translated in its own unique way in the art form, generalship is like that too. And you can see all these different kinds of generals who all have these different kinds of personalities, and they command that way. And the key is to try to find your strengths and then, figure out a way to make those strengths work for you on a battlefield. Take, for example, these really aggressive commanders, these quick-thinking, hard-pushing, dashing sort of guys. Heinz Guderian, the famous guy who basically created the German tank approach in the Second World War, he was that kind of guy. The guy, by the way, who's commanding the most important army on the German side in this war, the Sledgehammer Head Army, First Army, is a guy just like this too. Hard-driving, aggressive kind of guy. That sort of approach is perfect in some situations and in some armies, but then you need the bean counter guy sometimes too. That's what von Moltke is. He's a bean counter. He sits there and plans everything out to the nth degree and makes sure all the T's are crossed and the I's dotted and you don't have anything. I mean, those guys are very useful too. The inspirational generals like in Alexander the Great who get out there and get your troops to perform, feats of heroism that maybe a lesser man or woman couldn't have gotten them to perform. There's all these different kinds of generals. Joffre is the kind that doesn't ever get ruffled. That's what he brings to the table. He refuses to panic. He's almost frightfully calm in situations that he's about to experience that are not only stressful to the point of panic, but that perhaps panic is the right emotion to have. Now, there are historians out there who suggest that we should not look at that as such a great quality to bring to the table because it might be Joffre's own shortcomings in some of the other arts of generalship that made it necessary for there to be a guy who wouldn't panic at the top to begin with, wouldn't be needing to panic if you'd have been a better player of that blind chess game that we talked about earlier, and maybe Joffre's not that good at that game. Hence, the situation becomes panic-inducing. Hence, a leader that's very good at stopping panic is just what you need at the time. Anyway, might be a self-reinforcing sort of thing, but I think it's hard to deny that France would have given up a right arm and both legs to have this guy in the Second World War. And the reason that this guy's going to be so necessary, this imperturbability is going to be so necessary, is because of how this first round in this heavyweight championship fight that's going to go on for 4 years is going to go. If you're going to use a boxing analogy here for this, it's going to be a boring fight as the fight goes on, where things slow down to a dull roar and everybody's looking for tactical opportunities. But the first round is wild. Massive haymaker, swings, misses, dropping the other guy for, an 8 count. I mean, it's going to be a wild first round. And if you lose your head, you could lose the war. So having Joffre at the French high command shows that the French are not going to lose their head. I can't help but think about the German commander at this point, though. Von Moltke is a very interesting guy in the sense that he almost looks like a guy who doesn't want to be there. He is the nephew of one of the greatest heroes in German military history. It's almost like he went into the family business, but whereas those guys thought about nothing but war all the time, and remember, Schlieffen, the legendary writer of the Schlieffen Plan, is supposed to have died still saying stuff about the Schlieffen Plan. The last words on his lips are supposedly, "Make sure to keep the right wing strong." I mean, these are people who have no hobbies other than war. Von Moltke, the younger, is a guy who famously said that art was what he lived for. And I think about this guy in one of the most stressful positions in all history once this war breaks out. Remember, he has no illusions about what the stakes are. He's the one who famously said that the war that he's launching will decide the course of history for the next 100 years. And it certainly has. Think of the pressure on that, though. Think about the fact that his plan that he's operating with is a terrible gamble. And then watch how every flip of the coin so far in this conflict has gone against him. I mean, if you're judging this fight based on who landed the latest punch, von Moltke and the Germans are losing right from the very beginning. I mean, think about the coin flips that have already happened. I mean, think about the Belgium one to begin with. I mean, you were hoping that when you invaded Belgium, they just sort of stood by the side of the road and let you go through. Maybe would feed you and everything, right? That's what your hope was. Could have been a flip of the coin. Instead, the Belgians resisted you. They destroyed the communication and transportation system you were hoping to use. And then to make matters worse, some of them were shooting at you, allegedly. So your troops have been executing Belgians, which makes you look terrible on the world stage. So that coin flipped the wrong way. And then you flip the coin again. Maybe Britain won't get involved when we violate, the neutrality of Belgium, right? It's just a scrap of paper, as the German diplomat famously said. Oh, that landed on the wrong side of the coin, too. The British came in. You lost that flip. Another flip happens starting on August 15th, and the timetable's going to get weird now because there's stuff happening on multiple fronts that overlap with each other. Because while this is going on, you know, the first maneuvers are going on in the west too, but on the 15th of August, if you're von Moltke watching how your planned attack is going, and you haven't even gotten your sledgehammer head through Belgium yet, so you're still a ways away from your attack doing anything, but you've got things starting to collapse around you. On August 15th, the Serbs, remember this is a moderate country, fighting a great power. You know, some Serbian gunman killed the Austrian Archduke, and that's why we're here, right? I mean, the one thing everyone was sure about is that no matter what happens in this conflict, Serbia is going to get their butt kicked. Because they're fighting Austria-Hungary, who's right next door, and they're a global power. The Austro-Hungarians are camped out sort of on a hillside by a river. On the 15th of August, 180,000 Serbs attack them. The Austro-Hungarian army has about 200,000 people, and its morale just collapses. And we told you before, the Serbs are one of those people, historically, who in a military sense kind of punch above their weight class. They're ferocious fighters, they're aggressively led, and the Austro-Hungarian forces were apparently more riddled with problems than anyone knew, and a lot of them will drown, routing across this river, pursued closely by 180,000 Serbians in 3 armies. Think about what this does if you're von Moltke in terms of stress, because you're hoping that the Austro-Hungarians can help you keep the Russians off your neck until you're done in France. Remember, you got to deal with enemies on each side of you. You're hoping your ally right there is going to be able to help, and yet they just got their tail kicked by a moderate-sized power. What's going to happen when they face the Russians? And then, on the 17th of August, the biggest disaster at all, if you're von Moltke, occurs. And the Russians arrive early. Talk about flipping the coin before the war, assuming you can get all this stuff done before the Russians mobilize, and then they mobilize early. So by August 17th, von Moltke has problems everywhere, and it becomes a real question whether or not he's ever going to be able to use his war-winning sledgehammer, because maybe he'll have lost the war everywhere else before that even happens. I mean, there's writings you can read from this time period in 1914 that think that the war is almost already over. Meanwhile, on the 14th of August, Joffre and the French launch an attack into Alsace-Lorraine, the first real attack, I should say. They sent a token force in there on the 7th of August, which is, you know, got to remember, 7th of August is 4 days after France and Germany declare war on each other. They sent a token force in there, you know, with messages from the French leadership about, you know, here, we're home, you're back in the bosom of France, all these wonderful things, kisses, picnic baskets, flowers, wine, the whole deal, you know, welcome with open arms. And then all of a sudden, that little token force with the roses and wine and everything has to run back across the French border because the German force that's nearby is not a token force. So on August 14th, the day before the Serbs smash that Austro-Hungarian army that so discomforts von Moltke, the French launched 2 armies into Alsace-Lorraine, and it's serious now. Now it's on. Now we have 2 of the best armies in the world clashing head-on with significant numbers of people. And the French push the Germans back. And then the next day they push them back again. And then the next day they push them back again. Now, it should be noted that while the rest of the world thinks this looks like just one more disaster for Germany's side, you have all these other problems. The Russians are already in East Prussia, and now look at the French. The first time they launch a significant attack, the Germans are backing up. But that's one thing I'm sure von Moltke wasn't stressed about, because that retreat by the Germans was all part of the plan. The Germans, of course, for decades knew that the French would involve Alsace-Lorraine in any war effort, and so they put troops there who had orders to retire, to just sort of keep the French engaged, but move backwards as they move forwards, let them even into Germany. Shoot them as they're pursuing you, take your toll on them as they're pursuing you, but retire in good order, take your guns with you, and just sort of pull them away from all the parts of the war that matter. You see, When the French figure out about this sledgehammer, I've also compared it to a door on a hinge, because you have all these German armies stretching from the Swiss border all the way up to Belgium, and most of them are just there to keep the French occupied. The damage that's going to be done is going to be done by that door, sort of in Belgium and Luxembourg, that swings closed on top of the French nation. The other German army's job is to keep the French in front of them occupied, so they can't turn around and move in a different direction and do anything about that hammer. And those French armies way down south in Alsace and Lorraine, which are down by the Swiss border, that are pursuing German armies back into the interior of Germany, are just getting farther and farther away from where they can help once the French realize they need every army they can get their hands on to deal with that threat. So von Moltke's not upset about this. This is part of the deal. And that starts on August 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th. It continues. The Russians are in East Prussia now. The Austrians have been defeated on their front. Since the 7th of August, but really big on the 11th and 12th of August, the British Expeditionary Force has been arriving on the continent. And they keep saying they're not going to be ready to fight until maybe the 26th of August. But the French would like them there sooner. One Frenchman in particular is desperate to have the British show up as early as possible. This is the French general who is commanding the army on France's left flank, right? The last army, it's kind of facing sort of Belgium, where if you look to your right, they've got several armies, millions of men, all the way down to the Swiss border, totally protected from anybody penetrating our ranks and hitting us in the flank. But if that Fifth Army under a general named Lanrezac looks to the left, looks north, there's nobody there. There's open land. There's maneuvering room for an enemy to get around his flanks and destroy him and roll the whole French line up all the way down to Switzerland if necessary. So he's got a vested interest in being aware of any potential threats out there, because he's going to take it in the flank, when it shows up. And he perceives, even before the war starts, he's sending messages in July to Joffre saying, all signs point to a German advance through Belgium, basically. Which is one reason you knew the high command knew about it. Nobody knew how big it was going to be. But this general, Lanrezac, keeps telling them every couple of days. He's sending messages to the high command going, latest reports are, or huge attack. I mean, he basically, the way history will vindicate this guy is he correctly perceives the power and destination of this German blow long before anyone else does. And one of the historical what-ifs in this time period is, what if Joffre had taken what he was saying seriously sooner? Again, maybe you don't need to be such a wonderful stability factor when panic is all around you if you don't make a mistake like not listening to this general, which creates the panic-inducing situation to begin with. Joffre basically thinks the guy is panicking. And then he starts saying, as it becomes apparent that something is moving through Belgium, I mean, those forts are going down, he starts thinking this is going to be a good thing, for the same reason it's a good thing for the Germans to have those French go through Alsace-Lorraine and keep advancing away from where the action's going to be. Joffre's idea is, listen, even if the Germans are going through Belgium with a large force, all the better. Our plan's going to be to cut that large force off. If this is a swinging gate or door, we will hit it at the hinge, and then we will roll up behind it all the way up to the water, in the North Sea or the English Channel right there, and then you're cut off, and then this wonderful, sledgehammer blow becomes a surrounded, trapped cream of your army. So he turned a negative into a positive and basically would tell Lanrezac that you have nothing to worry about. Lanrezac thought different and figured his chances would be improved if that British force would hurry up and come up on his left, so that even though the British might have an open left flank, he wouldn't have one anymore. And it's at that point that the Battle of the Frontiers breaks out.
Hardcore battlefield. I came. You guys listened to Dan Carlin kind of rant a little bit there about war. Don't know if you enjoyed it. I had fun. Also, I'm not sober. If you want more Dan Carlin, if you want more hardcore history, use the Google. I highly suggest Blueprint for Armageddon, Wrath of the Khans, and Death Rows of the Republic by Hardcore History. If you want to learn more about WWI, also known as the Big One, also known as the War to End All Wars, pick up a book called A Higher Form of Killing. We may listen to that the next time we do Battlefield History. Thank you very much for watching, and full speed ahead and bash Jerry in the teeth to give him what for.